In a classroom rife with tension, led by a teacher with an underlying bias, an unexpected twist was on the verge of revealing years of hidden prejudice. This story will make you question what truly occurs behind classroom walls. The school bell chimed, marking the start of another day at Westfield High. Miss Roberts, standing tall and rigid at the front of her English class, scanned her students with a stern look as they settled into their seats. The air felt thick, charged with the familiar sense of unease that seemed to follow her lessons. As the final stragglers hurried in, a new face appeared at the doorway. Jasmine King entered, her backpack slung casually over one shoulder, and immediately caught the attention of the students. Some watched her with curiosity, while others cast more guarded, wary glances her way. Miss Roberts's lips pressed into a thin line as her eyes followed Jasmine's path to an empty desk. Well, Miss Roberts began, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. It appears we have a new addition to our class. I certainly hope you can keep up with our rigorous curriculum. The way she emphasized rigorous left little doubt about her true feelings. Jasmine met her gaze evenly, her expression composed, yet she remained silent. As Miss Roberts turned back to the board, a subtle but noticeable shift took place in the atmosphere. A storm was brewing just below the surface. The tension in the room was palpable, and it left a lingering question hanging in the air. What would happen when a teacher's prejudice clashed with the quiet strength of a student? Jasmine's next steps could very well alter the course of things. Clearing her throat, Miss Roberts fixed her gaze back on Jasmine, her eyes narrowing. Today we'll be exploring themes of power and oppression in To Kill a Mockingbird. Who would like to start us off? Her gaze swept the room, purposefully skipping over Jasmine's raised hand. She called on several other students, finally turning to Jasmine with a tight-lipped smile. Yes, Miss King, do you have something to contribute? Jasmine sat up a little straighter, her voice steady as she spoke. I believe the novel shines a light on systemic racism. Miss Roberts cut her off, her tone layered with condescension. Systemic racism? She repeated, her voice heavy with disdain. My dear, it seems you're confusing this American classic with some modern political agenda. A ripple of discomfort passed through the classroom. Some students fidgeted in their seats, while others seemed entertained by the unfolding drama. Jasmine took a deep breath, her fingers curling tightly around the edge of her desk. With all due respect, Miss Roberts, the racial injustices in the book are reflective of. That's quite enough. Miss Roberts interrupted with a dismissive wave of her hand. Perhaps you should concentrate on understanding the text as it's written, rather than trying to impose your interpretations. The room grew tense, the air thickening as silence settled over the students. Jasmine's jaw tightened, but her eyes never left Miss Roberts's face. She remained silent, yet her posture communicated a quiet defiance that clearly unsettled the teacher. Miss Roberts turned back to the whiteboard, her marker squeaking as she scrawled across it. Now, let's discuss the actual themes that the author intended. Can anyone explain the symbolism of the mockingbird? As the lesson wore on, Miss Roberts consistently overlooked Jasmine's raised hand, her gaze sliding right past her as if she were invisible. The message was unmistakable. Jasmine's voice held no place in this classroom. Some students exchanged concerned glances, uncomfortable with the overt dismissiveness. A few, however, seemed to revel in the teacher's behavior, casting smug looks in Jasmine's direction. Jasmine's frustration showed in the tight line of her shoulders and the controlled expression on her face. Yet she remained composed, her pen moving steadily as she took notes. It was a small act of defiance, a refusal to be silenced or denied her right to education. Toward the end of class, Miss Roberts announced an upcoming group project. I'll be assigning groups, she said, her tone sly. We wouldn't want anyone to feel out of place. Her words hung heavily in the air, a veiled challenge aimed at Jasmine. Jasmine's eyes narrowed slightly, fully recognizing the implications. She squared her shoulders, her gaze meeting Miss Roberts's with unwavering determination. The bell rang, signaling the end of class, and students began gathering their belongings. Jasmine took her time, her movements calm and unhurried. Just as she reached the door, Miss Roberts called out, Miss King, may I have a word? Jasmine turned, her expression carefully neutral. Yes, Miss Roberts? The teacher's smile was thin and sharp. I hope you understand that in this class, we prioritize facts and analysis over personal opinions or agendas. I'd hate to see you struggle because you can't separate your feelings from the curriculum. For a moment, Jasmine held her silence, then replied with a calm that concealed the fire simmering beneath her words. I understand, Miss Roberts. I look forward to demonstrating my analysis skills in our next discussion. With that, she turned and walked out. leaving Miss Roberts standing there, a flicker of doubt crossing her face. As days passed, Miss Roberts's initial discomfort solidified into a cold resolve. She was determined to show Jasmine who held the authority in this classroom, regardless of the consequences. The following week, Jasmine entered the classroom with her head held high, prepared to face whatever challenges Miss Roberts might impose. The teacher stood at the front, her eyes narrowing as she tracked Jasmine's every move. The air seemed to crackle with tension, the brewing storm drawing ever nearer. As the lesson began, Miss Roberts's scrutiny of Jasmine intensified, her gaze heavy on every movement and word that Jasmine uttered. "Miss King," she suddenly snapped, her voice as sharp as a blade. "Is that gum I see you chewing?" Jasmine paused, her hand halfway to her mouth, though she wasn't chewing gum at all. "No, Miss Roberts, she started, but was cut off abruptly. "Don't lie to me, young lady. Spit it out now." Miss Roberts's voice rang with disdain. Jasmine's classmates shifted in their seats, some averting their eyes while others watched with a certain fascination. Jasmine rose slowly, her movements deliberate. She walked to the trash can, pantomime spitting out the non-existent gum, then returned to her seat. Silence filled the room, the tension palpable. As class progressed, Miss Roberts's behavior became bolder. She began nitpicking every detail of Jasmine's participation, from the way she wrote to her posture. "Sit up straight, Miss King. This isn't some casual hangout spot," she barked, ignoring the fact that Jasmine's posture was no different from anyone else's. Jasmine's frustration was visible in the tension in her jaw, her fingers curling tightly around her pen. She took a few deep breaths, determined to keep her composure despite the continuous onslaught. Her resolve remained unbroken as the class wore on, her quiet determination only growing stronger in the face of the relentless challenge. The dynamics within the classroom began to shift as Miss Roberts's behavior toward Jasmine became more transparent. Some students, like Sarah in the front row, shot Jasmine sympathetic glances whenever the teacher's back was turned. However, others, emboldened by Miss Roberts's actions, joined in with subtle snickers and whispered remarks. During a group discussion, Jasmine raised her hand to contribute, only for Miss Roberts to give her a cold, insincere smile. "Yes, Miss King," she drawled, her tone dripping with disdain, "do enlighten us with your unique perspective." Jasmine's voice remained steady as she began, but Miss Roberts cut her off almost instantly. "I'm sorry, but could you please enunciate more clearly? Some of us can't understand certain dialects," she said, her voice layered with contempt. A shocked silence fell over the classroom as a collective gasp rippled through the students. Jasmine's eyes widened, her hands clenching into fists beneath her desk. The prejudice that had been carefully veiled was now fully exposed, raw and unmistakable. As the bell signaled the end of class, Miss Roberts called out, "Miss King, please stay behind. We need to discuss your performance." Jasmine approached the teacher's desk, her heart pounding, though her expression was calm and composed. Miss Roberts looked up, her eyes cold and scrutinizing. "I hope you understand, Miss King, that your attitude is becoming problematic. If you can't adapt to the standards of this class, perhaps you should consider finding a more suitable environment." The implications of her words hung heavy in the air. Jasmine took a slow, deliberate breath, keeping her voice firm and even. "I understand perfectly, Miss Roberts. I'll continue to do my best, as I always have." She turned to leave, only for Miss Roberts to call after her again. "Oh, and Miss King," she said with a smirk, "don't forget your group project presentation is due next week. I do hope you're prepared." Jasmine nodded, though her mind was already racing. She knew that Miss Roberts planned to use the presentation as an opportunity to humiliate her in front of the entire class. But Jasmine was resolute. She would not give Miss Roberts the satisfaction of seeing her falter. As the day of the presentation approached, the classroom buzzed with anticipation. Jasmine stepped up to the front, her heart steady despite the tension radiating from Miss Roberts, who watched her like a hawk, pen tapping on the grading sheet with a predatory gleam in her eyes. Jasmine had meticulously prepared her presentation, a detailed analysis of To Kill a Mockingbird that focused on themes of racial injustice and moral courage. As she began, Miss Roberts's smirk grew, as if waiting for the right moment to strike. Halfway through her presentation, Jasmine paused to address a question, only for Miss Roberts to raise her hand immediately. "Miss King," she said, her voice laced with mock sweetness, "I'm curious about your choice of focus. Don't you think you're overemphasizing certain aspects of the novel?" Jasmine furrowed her brow but answered steadily. "I believe the racial themes are central to understanding the book's message, Miss Roberts." Harper Lee herself said. Jasmine started, only for Miss Roberts to interrupt with a sharp tone. I'm well aware of what the author said, she snapped. But I'm more interested in why you seem unable to appreciate the broader literary merits beyond your personal biases. Another gasp swept through the classroom, and Jasmine's hands clenched at her sides as she struggled to maintain her composure. I don't believe my analysis is biased, Miss Roberts, she said, her voice calm but edged with emotion. Each point I made is supported with textual evidence and scholarly sources. Miss Roberts abruptly stood, the chair scraping loudly against the floor as she walked to the front, placing herself between Jasmine and the rest of the class. Let me make something clear, Miss King, she said, her voice cold and unyielding. This obsessive focus on race is not only misguided, it's disruptive to the learning environment. Perhaps at your previous school, such narrow interpretations were acceptable. But here we expect a higher level of academic rigor. The room fell silent, the tension so thick it felt suffocating. Some students stared at their desks, unable to look at Jasmine, while others watched the confrontation with horrified fascination. Miss Roberts continued her tirade, her voice rising as she spoke. Furthermore, your insistence on forcing modern political agendas into classic literature demonstrates a fundamental lack of understanding. I'm beginning to question whether you're truly capable of handling this curriculum. Jasmine's eyes glistened with unshed tears, but she refused to look away or back down. With respect, Miss Roberts, I disagree, she said, her voice trembling slightly but determined. The themes of racial injustice in To Kill a Mockingbird are as relevant today as they were when the book was written. Ignoring them does a disservice to the author's intent. Enough, Miss Roberts snapped. Your attitude is bordering on insubordination. I suggest you take your seat and reflect on whether you're truly prepared for the standards of this class. Jasmine gathered her materials slowly, feeling the weight of humiliation pressing down on her shoulders. As she moved to sit down, a small voice spoke up from the back of the room. I thought Jasmine's presentation was really good. The student, a boy named Peterson, said quietly. Miss Roberts whirled around, her eyes flashing with anger. And what exactly would you know about literary analysis, Mr. Peterson? Perhaps you'd like to join Miss King in detention if you're so eager to express your own academic shortcomings. The boy shrank back, silenced, while Miss Roberts turned her steely gaze back to Jasmine, who stood frozen by her desk. Well, what are you waiting for? Sit down, so we can proceed with presentations that are actually worth our time. Jasmine sank into her seat, her face flushed with a mixture of anger and shame. She could feel the eyes of her classmates on her, some filled with sympathy, others with barely concealed amusement. The injustice of it all threatened to overwhelm her. But she took a few deep, steadying breaths as Miss Roberts called the next student to present. Her mind raced, and though she knew she couldn't challenge Miss Roberts directly without risking further humiliation, a quiet determination began to grow within her. She wouldn't let this stand. Somehow she would find a way to make her voice heard. As Jasmine sat there, thoughts of justice and retribution churning within her, fate intervened with an unexpected twist. The classroom door opened and Miss Roberts looked up, a smug smile already curving on her lips. Class, she announced, her tone overly saccharine, I have an important announcement. I've decided it's time for a parent-teacher conference regarding Miss King's performance. Jasmine's heart began to race, a mixture of dread and defiance coursing through her veins. She knew her father would stand by her side, but the thought of him confronting Miss Roberts, of watching her twisted biases play out in front of her family, filled her with an unsettling blend of emotions. She straightened, her determination hardening. Whatever came next, she would face it head-on, prepared to confront the prejudice that had for too long been allowed to fester in silence. The storm of tension continued to build in the small conference room as Miss Roberts grew increasingly oblivious to the principal's quiet, measured demeanor. She continued speaking, her voice thick with self-assuredness. You see, Mr. King, I've been concerned about Jasmine's disruptive behavior. Her performance and attitude are simply incompatible with the standards we uphold in this school. Mr. King remained silent, his eyes fixed on Miss Roberts, who interpreted his silence as agreement. For instance, she continued, she challenges me constantly, and it's not just her words, it's her tone, her mannerisms. She gives off this sense of superiority, as if she knows better. And in my classroom, that's unacceptable. He nodded, his face unreadable. I see. And you believe Jasmine's background might explain this, is that right? His words were deceptively simple, but they had an edge that was impossible to miss. Miss Roberts smiled, mistaking his question for sympathy. Exactly. I don't know where she attended before, but I can only assume that her previous school did not hold students to the same rigorous standards we do here. There's no way she could have been exposed to the kind of intellectual environment we strive to foster at our institution. Mr. King's jaw tightened slightly as he leaned forward, his eyes meeting hers directly. Miss Roberts, let me clarify something for you, he said, his voice controlled but firm. Jasmine is my daughter, and I've raised her to be respectful, curious, and unafraid to engage with ideas, even those that may challenge her or others. Miss Roberts froze, her mouth slightly open as she processed his words. The smug confidence drained from her face, replaced by an expression of disbelief and dawning realization. Oh, I didn't realize. Mr. King continued, undeterred by her sudden discomfort. I've reviewed Jasmine's academic record, and let me assure you, she has excelled in environments that value both intellectual rigor and respectful discourse. In fact, we moved here specifically because we believed this school would support her growth, offering her an environment where her voice would be respected. Miss Roberts stammered, her usual composure slipping. Well, I apologize, Mr. King. I had no idea she was related to you. Mr. King's gaze did not waver. That's precisely the problem, Miss Roberts. It shouldn't matter who Jasmine's parents are. She deserves to be treated with the same respect and encouragement as any student. Discrediting her ideas or belittling her perspectives because they don't align with your interpretation of the curriculum is not only unprofessional, it's a betrayal of the very purpose of education. Miss Roberts flushed, momentarily at a loss for words. She began to speak, then stopped, clearly grasping for an explanation that would redeem her behavior. I only meant to guide her, Mr. King. To Kill a Mockingbird is about so much more than race. It's a story about humanity, universal morals. Yes, but it's also a story that confronts the painful realities of racial injustice, Mr. King said, his tone unwavering. Dismissing Jasmine's interpretation because it emphasizes race, especially when that's an undeniable theme of the novel, sends a message that certain perspectives, her perspectives, are unwelcome here. And that's a message I simply cannot tolerate. He leaned back, his calm demeanor returning as he watched her wrestle with his words. As her teacher, it's your responsibility to cultivate her strengths, to encourage her intellectual bravery, not to silence her for the sake of convenience or personal comfort. Miss Roberts swallowed, nodding slowly as the gravity of his words sank in. You're absolutely right, Mr. King, she murmured, visibly contrite. I apologize if I allowed any personal biases to influence my teaching. That was never my intention. Mr. King regarded her for a moment before continuing. Intentions aside, actions matter more. Jasmine deserves a fair chance to succeed in this class, free from hostility or prejudice. Going forward, I expect her to be treated with the respect she's earned, and I expect to see evidence that her ideas, her voice, will be given equal weight. Miss Roberts nodded again, her earlier bravado now fully dissolved. Of course, Mr. King. I'll do better. I'll ensure Jasmine has a positive experience in my class from now on. Satisfied, Mr. King stood, his posture relaxed but commanding. Good, he said simply. I trust you'll keep your word. As he turned to leave, Miss Roberts watched him go, the weight of the conversation still settling over her. She returned to the classroom a few minutes later, visibly changed, her confidence now subdued and introspective. The students immediately noticed the shift in her demeanor as she re-entered the room, and a quiet buzz of whispers filled the air. Jasmine glanced at her teacher, and though no words were exchanged, there was a mutual understanding that something significant had taken place beyond those classroom doors. Miss Roberts cleared her throat, her voice softer than before. Thank you for waiting, everyone. Now, let's return to the lesson, she said, her tone markedly free from the harshness that had colored her interactions with Jasmine before. For the first time in weeks, Jasmine felt a sense of relief settle over her. The battle was not entirely over, but a victory had been won that day. She straightened in her seat, a small smile touching her lips as she prepared for the lesson ahead. Whatever challenges might come, she was ready to face them, stronger and more resilient than before. I believe it's time to clarify something for you, Mr. King stated, directing his attention toward Miss Roberts. Jasmine's previous education was exemplary. In fact, I can personally vouch for that. The frown on Miss Roberts's face indicated her confusion. I don't understand. How could you possibly know that? She questioned, her voice tinged with skepticism. Mr. King's unwavering gaze met hers. I know because I'm Jasmine's father. As the weight of his revelation settled in, the color drained from Miss Roberts's face. Her mouth opened and closed multiple times, but no words emerged. The self-assuredness that had accompanied her throughout the conversation vanished instantaneously. You're Jasmine's father? Miss Roberts stammered, her eyes wide with shock and dread. Mr. King nodded solemnly. Yes, Miss Roberts. Jasmine King is my daughter, and I've been listening intently to everything you've said about her. Stumbling backward, Miss Roberts grasped a nearby desk for support, her mind grappling with the gravity of her actions and the prejudices she had inadvertently disclosed to the school's principal, and more critically to a father. Mr. King, I had no idea, she managed to whisper, her voice barely audible. Clearly, Mr. King replied, his tone heavy, causing Miss Roberts to flinch. But ignorance is not an excuse for the behavior you've exhibited. You have not only shown a blatant bias against my daughter, but your remarks also indicate a pattern of discrimination that extends beyond just one student. Miss Roberts's mind raced as she desperately sought a way to mitigate the situation. Mr. King, please, let me explain. I never intended to. Mr. King raised a hand to silence her. I believe you've said quite enough, Miss Roberts. We will have a much more extensive discussion about this later. For now, I suggest you return to your classroom. We wouldn't want to keep the students waiting, would we? As Miss Roberts numbly nodded and prepared to leave, Mr. King added, Oh, and Miss Roberts, I'll be observing your class for the rest of the day. I'm very interested in witnessing your teaching methods firsthand. Mr. King's calm demeanor concealed the turmoil beneath as he re-entered the classroom, closely followed by a visibly shaken Miss Roberts. The atmosphere shifted dramatically. Students straightened in their seats, acutely aware of the tension crackling in the air. Class, Mr. King began, his voice steady yet firm. We need to discuss a significant issue regarding respect, diversity, and the true essence of education. Miss Roberts stood stiffly by her desk, her prior confidence completely evaporated. She stole nervous glances at both Mr. King and Jasmine, her mind racing to comprehend the implications of the moment. Mr. King's gaze swept across the room. I've been informed of troubling incidents occurring in this class, incidents that go against everything our school represents. A collective gasp rippled through the students, many exchanging furtive looks at Jasmine as the pieces began to align. Miss Roberts, would you care to explain to the class why you deemed it necessary to consistently undermine and belittle one of your students? The teacher's mouth opened and closed, her words escaping her. Mr. King, I never meant to. Never meant to what, Miss Roberts? Mr. King's voice rose slightly, the composure he had worked so hard to maintain beginning to unravel. Never meant to make racially biased assumptions about a student's background? Never meant to dismiss valid interpretations of literature simply because they didn't fit your narrow viewpoint? The students watched in astonished silence as their typically mild-mannered principal transformed before their eyes. His words were precise and cutting, exposing the injustices that had lingered beneath the surface of their classroom for weeks. Let me be clear, Mr. King continued, his eyes fixed on Miss Roberts. Your treatment of Jasmine, and I suspect other students of color, is not only unprofessional, but profoundly damaging. You have fostered an environment in which students feel unsafe expressing their thoughts and experiences. Miss Roberts attempted to interject, her voice trembling. Mr. King, please, if I could just explain. Explain what exactly? He interjected, his patience dwindling. Explain how you mocked Jasmine's analysis of To Kill a Mockingbird because it addressed racial themes. Explain how you have consistently ignored her raised hand during class discussions. Or perhaps you'd like to justify your comment about her previous education being deficient, simply because she doesn't fit into your preconceived notions. The blood drained from Miss Roberts's face as Mr. King recounted her actions. She glanced around the room, searching for any sign of support, but only encountered shocked and disappointed faces staring back at her. Mr. King addressed the class once more. Students, I want you to grasp something essential. Education is not about silencing voices or dismissing perspectives that challenge our own. It's about broadening our understanding, engaging in respectful dialogue, and learning from varied experiences. He paused, allowing his words to resonate. What you've witnessed in this classroom is not education. It's discrimination, plain and simple, and it ends today. The tension in the room was palpable. Some students shifted uncomfortably, while others nodded in agreement with Mr. King's statements. Jasmine sat quietly, her eyes glistening with unshed tears of relief and vindication. Mr. King's gaze returned to Miss Roberts, who seemed to shrink under his scrutiny. Miss Roberts, your actions have revealed a clear pattern of discrimination that extends beyond a single student. This behavior is unacceptable and will be addressed through the appropriate channels. For now, I will take over your class for the remainder of the day. As Miss Roberts hurriedly gathered her belongings, her movements were shaky and uncoordinated. The gravity of the situation finally seemed to register. She cast one last desperate look around the classroom before exiting. The silence that followed her departure was deafening. Mr. King took a deep breath, visibly calming himself before addressing the class again. I apologize that you've had to witness this, but it's crucial for you to understand that prejudice and discrimination have no place in our school or in society. He moved to the front of the classroom, his posture slightly relaxing. Some students appeared shell-shocked, others looked relieved, and a few cast apologetic glances at Jasmine, the weight of their silent complicity heavy in the air. Mr. King cleared his throat to regain the class's focus. I understand, has been an intense and emotional experience for you all. We will be bringing in a counselor to help process what has transpired. For now, class is dismissed early. Please take this time to reflect on what you've seen and how we can work together to cultivate a more inclusive environment. As the students filed out, many paused to offer words of encouragement to Jasmine. Sarah, who had always sat quietly in the front row, approached her hesitantly. I'm so sorry I didn't speak up, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I knew something wasn't right, but I was scared. It won't happen again. Jasmine nodded, a small smile of understanding lighting up her face. Thank you, Sarah. Speaking up is challenging, but it's how we can make things better. Outside the classroom, whispers spread quickly among the students, as they formed small groups to discuss the events they had witnessed. As Jasmine emerged, flanked by her father, a hush enveloped the hallway. Gradually, a ripple of applause began, starting with a few students and swelling until it echoed throughout the corridor. Jasmine walked with her head held high, the fear and isolation she had endured for weeks fading away, replaced by a newfound sense of empowerment. Her classmates weren't merely acknowledging her now. They were truly recognizing her strength and resilience. Meanwhile, in the administrative office, Miss Roberts was facing the repercussions of her actions. The school board convened an emergency meeting, and within hours, a decision was made. As the final bell rang, signaling the end of the school day, Miss Roberts was escorted from the building by security. A cardboard box, filled with her personal belongings, clutched tightly to her chest. Students observed from windows and doorways as their former teacher walked to her car, her career and education effectively over. There was no sense of satisfaction in the scene, only a somber acknowledgement that actions indeed have consequences. The following morning, as Jasmine approached the school, she noticed a palpable shift in the atmosphere. Students who had previously shied away from her now offered friendly smiles and waves in the hallways. She overheard snippets of conversations about diversity workshops and plans for a cultural awareness club. Upon entering her English classroom, now temporarily led by a substitute, Jasmine was met with a sea of supportive faces. The tension that had enveloped the room for weeks had dissipated, replaced by a sense of openness and mutual respect. During lunch, Jasmine found herself surrounded by classmates eager to hear her thoughts on how to foster a more inclusive school environment. Ideas flowed freely, ranging from diversifying the curriculum to establishing mentorship programs for minority students. For the first time, Jasmine felt genuinely heard and valued. After school, as Jasmine walked out with her father, they passed by Miss Roberts's now empty parking space. Mr. King gently squeezed his daughter's shoulder. You know, Jasmine, what transpired here isn't just about one teacher or one classroom. It serves as a reminder that change is achievable, but it requires courage to speak out and stand firm against injustice. Jasmine nodded, her expression contemplative. I just hope it makes a difference beyond today. There are so many others who face discrimination every day, both in and out of school. The events at Westfield High had exposed how prejudice can manifest even within educational environments. Miss Roberts's treatment of Jasmine unveiled deep-seated biases that had gone unchecked for far too long. Yet, Jasmine's bravery in speaking up ignited a transformation. The school community rallied together, creating a more inclusive environment. New initiatives, diversity training, and open discussions challenged long-held assumptions. Students and teachers alike were prompted to confront their biases and blind spots. Jasmine's evolution from a victim to a leader demonstrated the power of resilience in the face of injustice, and her determination to transform pain into positive change inspired others to reflect on their beliefs and actions.